should get a message. That's the message. So we're now recording. So everything from this point on will be recorded. So I think that's all I really need to say at this juncture. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which is like the cover screen for it all. And now you can see the four panelists. You can see myself, Dr. Hirons, Dr. Sjöman, and Ellen Carvey from Barcham Trees. And Ellen waves because Ellen's friendly. The rest of us are not friendly. And Dr. Hirons is now about to share his screen. And I will now hand over to you, Andy, and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Keith, and welcome to all that have joined us. Thanks for taking the time today to step into this Barcham briefing. And it's a great privilege to kick off this new series with my good friend and colleague, Henrik. And I'm just going to start talking about tree selection. And I'm going to try and introduce the sort of context of the seminar and provide a whole sort of series of evidence-based approaches that I hope that you'll be able to engage with. I think, you know, as urban forest, so well, some of us will be managers, some of us will be contractors or specifiers, but as people that are engaged with urban forest management, if you like, there are a whole series of strategic challenges. And if you consider the urban forest as a sort of a pool of or a collection of trees, you know, you hope that most will be performing well. Of course, inevitably, some will be in that sort of poor performance threshold. But we have the challenge of climate change and the challenge of the accelerated migration of pests and pathogens that are likely to drive much of the urban forest through that poor performance and perhaps even beyond into a tree mortality threshold. So they're the sorts of challenges that we really need to engage with, I think. And certainly species diversity, species selection, therefore, is critical to these challenges. I have a bit of a penchant for old tree books, and this is one of the books that sits on my shelves, Shade Trees in Towns and Cities by William Solotoroff. And over 100 years ago, Washington, DC had 30 varieties that they experimented with, and only 10 to 12 of those were deemed to be desirable for streets. In Paris, the book records that there were 11 species with more than 100 specimens, and only 9 species with more than 1,000 specimens, and actually 50% of the whole urban forest in Paris was made up of just 2 species, the horse chestnut and the oriental plane. And a quote that I think is quite profound in some senses says, at all points considered, the oriental plane makes such an admirable street tree that there's a temptation to plant it to the exclusion of other trees. Well, you know, in actual fact, it may not be the oriental plane, or certainly not just the oriental plane, but that temptation is what we have in many ways succumbed to. We find something that works, and we use that sort of historical imperative to keep on planting the same thing. And if we take a look around the globe, we see this historical legacy in all sorts of cities. Helsinki, for example, over 40% of the street trees are lime. In Beijing, 25% of the trees are the pagoda trees. Bangkok, over 40% are pterocarpus. And you know, you see this trend over the globe, and there are an increasing number of studies that come out and have sort of done these sort of analyses. One of the more recent of those studies is by Nadina Hull, and she mapped some street tree inventories using open data. And I just want to sort of point to a few of those findings. Actually, none of the city centre regions that she looked at actually had a threshold that was really ideal in many ways. So she looked at, or her team looked at central urban areas and outer fringes. And you can see, I've just highlighted some of the findings in pink there, where the ideal species, genus, family thresholds weren't sort of really met. And you can see on only a few occasions were in the global cities were they met. And I think that's quite indicative of to say lots of global considerations and lots of global cities. There's another study by Alain Paquette, based in Canada. He looked at the diversity in a different range of cities, and we can see that these paired bars, the left-hand bar indicates the percentage that the lighter green is the top 5 species make up, and the darker green is the top species. So you can see that in some cases, so Edmonton in Prairie, the Prairie sort of region of Canada, 67% of the urban forest is made up of the top 5 species. 25% is the top species. And so we see that while there is variation, there's this overwhelming dominance of a few species making up a large percentage of the global tree population, urban tree population. The lime green bar is actually quite an interesting metric, and that's the effective number of species. And that's a metric that combines the species richness with its evenness. And that's what they're calling the effective number of species, or the true diversity. And so that gives an indication of, how different cities might perform if you sort of integrate that species richness and evenness. And so I think that is quite a useful approach. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about this paper is that it advocates a shift from the use of taxonomic ratios to functional diversity. So the taxonomic ratios would be Santamore's 10-20-30 rule, where you have 10% of species, 20% in a genus, and 30% in a family. But this paper really advocates a shift to functional diversity and the evaluation of populations into functional groups. And I think that is quite an interesting way going forward, and quite an interesting approach going forward, because it really does, rather than take a taxonomic approach, looks at how species will perform in different conditions ecologically, how they're functionally diverse, and that is most likely to give a better future resilience. So I think that's quite a useful paper. You might be interested to know that there's now a global urban tree inventory, and urban tree species have been assessed at, well, within the inventories, 4,734 species have been identified, and they did, that's likely to be quite conservative. They've done some estimations statistically that suggest that it could even be over 8,000. But it's about 8% of the known global tree flora. Of course, urban climates exist all over the world, and a whole range of different floristic regions and climate zones are represented in that. Some of those species are potentially invasive. We haven't got to look too far to see where invasive problems might be within the urban realm. Some of those species are even extinct in the wild. Some are certainly critically endangered or endangered. So there's actually a pretty big resource within the urban environment. for species, but it is all about making sure that there's a diversity of species within the population, and that is one of the things that will secure the greatest resilience going forward. Just to pick up on that accelerated migration of pests and pathogens and that strategic challenge, this is some work that Henrik with his colleague Johan Osberg did a couple of years ago. And this looks at just two longhorn beetles, the Asian longhorn beetle and the citrus longhorn beetle, and the impact in some Scandinavian cities. And under the worst case scenario, over 90% of the street trees in those cities would be threatened by just these two insect pests. Even under more expected scenarios, if you like, we're getting in the realm of about 50%. So, these are really profound and major threats. From a climate change point of view, it's difficult, isn't it, to really get your head around all the different scenarios. But if we sort of take the most likely scenario, the summers in the realm of 2060 to 79 are likely to be warmer and drier. And that's quite well established now. There is some variation across the UK, but that's where we're at. The winters are likely to be warmer and wetter. And so, again, that can bring a slightly different series of problems. So that's the best sort of estimations that we have at the national level. And there are tools now that exist to show where the projections of our future climate currently exist. And this is a tool, climatematch.org.uk. You can play around with it. There are different ways in which you can interrogate the data, but this is one I played with for London in 2050 to 2060. It's going to have a quite similar climate to Paris today and parts of sort of central Ukraine, as well as parts of Germany and Austria. Vienna, for example, is going to be quite close to what London is projected in the future. Further forward, we again get those pockets of climate similarity with Paris, and central Ukraine anyway. So we should in many ways perhaps be looking to those areas now and trying to understand what's performing well in the urban environments in those places in order to be able to anticipate what might happen in our own environment, in this case, London. I thought it'd be interesting to look at Preston because that's where I'm from. And you'll be pleased to know that Preston doesn't get such exciting climate analogies. We are most closely correlated with places like Cardiff, much of Ireland, Dusseldorf and Gothenburg. So I don't think we'll be hitting the Mediterranean that quickly in Preston. But that, I think it shows you that that we have quite a range of predictions even within the UK. So the southeast London has quite different projections going forward to that of, for example, the northwest. One of the things that is really going to be significant going forward, bearing in mind those changes in climate and those projections that we've just seen, is that the access to water is going to be something that trees really struggle with. And so it's important that we understand how trees cope with limited water availability, because that can really improve the way we select trees. And so just briefly then, if we look at a scheme that divides these adaptations into the avoidance of the deficit building up and the tolerance, that's quite a useful scheme to sort of try and understand, we see that trees can either avoid deficits by maximizing water acquisition or by reducing their water use. And they do that with a whole range of physiological, structural, and life cycle approaches. The most important, perhaps, is something like deep rooting for maximizing water acquisition. If a tree can get into a very deep water source, then it effectively decouples its hydraulic experience, its water status, from precipitation, from the rainfall, because it can just access this groundwater. It doesn't matter how much it rains on the surface if it's got access to that. And so that is a major adaptation of Mediterranean savanna trees, even warm temperate trees, to have quite deep rooting environments. There are other ways that it can do that, but we won't speak too much about those. It can reduce water use through stomatal closure. They're the pores in the leaves, and if they close up, then that reduces the water use. That helps avoid the deficit building up within the tree. And there are things like leaf abscission that in some cases can be quite important for reducing water use. And you see that in sensitive species, they lose their leaves. One of the things that I think as selectors we might be interested in is the tolerance of water deficits. The osmotic adjustment of the leaves, we'll speak a little bit more about that, can lead to a reduction or lowering of the leaf turgor loss point. And that's a critical measure of how drought tolerant a species is. And there can be other structural adaptations that help it reduce a process known as cavitation. And it's these sorts of characteristics and traits that really help us to evaluate the drought tolerance of a species in quite a quantitative way. And so from a selection point of view, what we want to do is avoid the avoiders, particularly for those challenging sites. So here on the left, we see a lime avenue, double avenue there, that I drive past on the way to work. And this is in, I think, early July. The tree should be going absolutely fine, going great guns. But this was in 2018 when we had that really dry early summer period. And you can see that it almost looks like autumn underneath that avenue, such as the leaf abscission, as initially the stomata would have closed, and then as the water deficit build up, the leaves are lost, because as you lose that surface area for evaporation, you lose the demand for water. And that essentially helps to protect the integrity of the remaining tree. And so that's an important strategy. And the same with this Betula utilis on the right. You stick it in a cubic meter of soil and you don't water it, and not surprisingly, it's going to suffer from water deficits. And after the stomatal closure hasn't worked terribly effectively, it just starts losing its leaves. Now, these are not particularly useful strategies for urban environments that might be really likely to get problems with drought or water deficits building up on a regular basis. So we should probably steer away from some of these species in the most constrained sites, certainly. Much better to look at drought-tolerant trees that have this sort of inherent ability to deal with water deficits. They're able to extract water from the soil for longer during the drying cycle. They maintain physiological activity for longer. That means that they're going to sequester carbon more effectively. They're going to cool more effectively, and ultimately perform much better. And ginkgo is a good example of one of those trees. So we then think about how we might select trees for drought tolerance, and you can engage with the literature, and there's many happy hours that can be spent poring over tree books. But if you do so and you sort of really focus down on particular species you might be interested in, you find that there's quite a variety of information and statements about a single species. So just looking at this Ace Negundo, some references say it's useful for sandy, dry, sterile soils, drought tolerant. You get others saying it's native habitats along streams and ponds, suggesting it might prefer slightly wetter environments. And native in moist habitats, but performs well also in poor wet or dry habitats. This is a classic case of sitting on the fence, I'm afraid, and there's really very little a specifier can do with that sort of information. And then others say heat and drought tolerant, and we get this kind of real mix of information. And that's really difficult for garden designers or landscape architects, other tree specifiers to really know where to place a tree when you get that sort of range of information coming from the plant use literature. So we might engage with ecological studies and meta-analysis, and that's certainly one of the things that I did when I was with Henrik developing the TDAG tree species selection guide. And we looked at, for example, this ecological monograph, which ranked species according to a drought tolerance scale that considered things like annual precipitation, how that precipitation is distributed across the growing season, the ratio between precipitation and potential evapotranspiration of the site, soil water potential duration of the dry period. So we had quite a strong framework, and they allocated about 800 species according to this scale. And so that enabled us to use our own scale that was more qualitative, to sort of just have a bit more underpinning where possible, where we had some good ecological evidence. And yeah, so that is a really useful source of information, but it's not perfect. One of the things that I think we need to recognize is some of the ecological information deals with survival, but it doesn't necessarily equal performance in our urban landscape. So just because a species will survive, it might survive by losing all of its leaves, and that's not necessarily what we would want in an urban landscape or a garden. So we need to be cautious about interpreting ecological literature. And one of the ways in which we can sort of add value to some of those big sort of ecological meta-analyses is by doing trait-based assessments, by looking at ecological strategies, and more recently having opportunities to interrogate the biogeographical data. And I'm going to pick up a little bit on this trait-based assessment. I think Henrik's going to be speaking about ecological strategies, and I say I'll just perhaps introduce biogeographical data as well towards the end of this presentation. But one of the traits that we have is the turgor loss point, and the leaf turgor loss point is quite a good quantitative measure of drought tolerance, and it's quite an established ecological trait, and it's used really quite widely in lots of different biomes, tropical, temperate, savanna biomes, and so on, to indicate the drought tolerance of a species. And what it does is it shows the water potential at which the tree will no longer recover from wilting. And so from that point of view, it's a really useful trait to understand. And the first big study that we did was Henrik's study based at Cornell University, where we looked at maple species, and they had a particularly good collection of maple species at Cornell, and Henrik spent a long summer collecting the turgor loss data for these species, and I think there's 26 species there that were represented in the data set, and you can see that there are two values for each species. The dark black bar is a spring measure, and the lighter grey bar is a summer measure, and they're ranked according to their summer turgor loss point. And the more negative the turgor loss point, the more drought tolerant that particular species is. And so Henrik went around the collections all around the university, mostly in their botanical collections, and collected this data. And you can see that we got a really wide range of turgor loss points. This is an example of one of those species, Acis plicatum. It grows in the understory of the forest there, quite close to watercourses. It's shaded, it's humid, and as such, it didn't really develop a very negative turgor loss point, minus 1.6 megapascals. It's really quite sensitive to drought. Acis truncatum, which comes originally from the Qingling Mountains in China, was around minus 2.4 megapascals. But the more drought-tolerant maple species, Acis tectaricum, that would grow naturally in the steppe forest, that came out at minus 3.6 megapascals, and Acis grandidentatum, minus 3.8 megapascals, and in fact, Acis montpecillanum came out at around minus 4 megapascals. So you could see that even though the material was collected from a single botanic collection, actually, according to their natural habitats, we got a separation in their turgor loss point, and therefore their inherent drought tolerance. And we were also able to pick out differences in cultivars. And interestingly, both the Acis saccharum cultivar Green Mountain and the Acis rubrum cultivar Northwood are from the westernmost portion of their range, and that's the driest portion of their range. So we can see here that we're able to select cultivars that have provenances in drier ecotypes. And so that's a really useful finding, because often you don't know where a cultivar has come from. And so if you can use this sort of analysis to indicate which cultivars are the most drought tolerant, then that can be really helpful in steering people towards more drought tolerant cultivars in their selection. And so what we might have is, if we take that general scheme and we have a whole load of species that are more sensitive or more tolerant to drought, and we take species with a high or a less negative turgor loss point and try to put them in some really constrained urban planting beds, they're likely to fail because they haven't got the physiological apparatus to deal with those sorts of conditions. Whereas if we take them from lower down the list, if you like, or the more negative species, then they're much more likely to survive because they have a better drought tolerance and more negative turgor loss point. And so we were quite excited by these early findings. The fact that we could separate species out across quite a wide variation of turgor loss points. So that was really helpful. And we think it also provides evidence for new species and new material going forward. We can do this sort of analysis. And since then, we've done, well, hundreds of species at various different places, from Nest Botanic Gardens, Kew, Hillier Nurseries, contributed material, of course, ONUP, SLU, ONUP, and so on. So we have quite a good information on lots of species, and we were able to use that data to help deliver particular qualitative terms within the Trees and Design Action Group guide. So, for example, those species that were higher than minus 2.5 megapascals were deemed to be sensitive. Between minus 2.5 and 3 megapascals were deemed to be moderately sensitive. Between minus 3 and minus 3.5 megapascals, moderately tolerant to drought. And anything with a turgor loss point more negative than minus 3.5, we called drought tolerant, or tolerant to drought. So it was a really good way for us to add a little bit more evidence, a little bit more data behind some of the terms that we use in the guidance. And subsequently we've been able to do sort of genotypic analysis, and we found that generally speaking, magnolia and betula are really sensitive to drought. We have a range of genera in the middle there: Tilia, Ulmus, Fraxinus, Carpinus, that are somewhat sort of average, if you like, and quite a lot of the Quercus do seem to be much more tolerant to drought. Although I have to say our Quercus robur is not really one that's bucking that trend. But anyway, we've done some good analysis now across a whole range of temperate species. And we also find that the Turgor loss point scales quite well with the ecological scores that Ninimets and Valaderis did that I mentioned earlier. So this study, and then there's actually a number of studies coming out now that really support the evidence base for Turgor loss point being a useful thing to measure in trees. Well, I just also wanted to speak briefly about waterlogging, because this is something that I've been interested in recently, and although the summer droughts are likely to be more profound, the intensity of summer rainfall is likely to be much greater as well. And so understanding waterlogging responses is also going to be quite important. And so this was a study I started a couple of years ago, and I effectively just waterlogged the trees in the big bucket of water, and I used sap flow as a key variable to measure their response. And here we see the sap flow of Prunus macchii, which is deemed to be a sensitive species. You can see that the two treatments were rather similar before they were waterlogged, and then quite quickly they separate out during that waterlogged phase. And that was really interesting to find. So we got these daily increases and decreases in sap velocity, and that's to be expected. That's a normal way. Trees wake up, they start transpiring, the sap flow goes up, but the magnitude of that sap flow really differed quite a lot within the treatments. So I waterlogged them, and very quickly that treatment sort of separated out. The interesting thing was that actually there were no visual differences between the trees. So there were profound physiological differences, but no visual differences. And that was, I think, quite interesting. And I won't go through all this data, but we saw quite profound drops in gas exchange as well. So photosynthesis and stomatoconductance, for example, all reduced quite profoundly in that waterlog treatment, and didn't really recover actually after they were drained. This is Acer-platanoides. So pre-treatment, it's the performing pretty similarly, and then when they were waterlogged, it really pretty much crashed in terms of sap flow. And even after I drained all the water out, the decline in the waterlogged treatment was quite profound. And so what we had is no real visual differences at the point of maximum waterlogging, but something was clearly happening, because even when they were drained, it got progressively worse, and indeed all the leaves fell off. And there's this what we call post-anoxic stress, which can be quite profound in some species. So the reoxygenation of the root zone caused a big stress, as well as the initial waterlogging event. And again, of course, to be expected, we saw big drops in photosynthesis and stomatoconductance associated with that stress period. Now we look at a tolerant species, and this is, again, the sap flow trace. It's all over the place. It was a very kind of wet, dry kind of funny week that I evaluated this particular species. So hence you got lots of noise, if you like, in the sap velocity data. But what you can see is that the treatments basically didn't separate. So in other words, as you might expect, the salix was able to tolerate and keep performing well under waterlogged conditions, despite the fact that it was sitting in water. And that contrasted clearly with the prunus and the acer that I've just shown. So that was really an interesting finding, and it's quite a nice way to evaluate species using sap flow, because you get this kind of continuous feedback. And there was a reduction in gas exchange properties at peak stress, but that certainly recovered very quickly after the tree was drained and the oxygen was allowed back into the root zone. And of course, we know that the willow has hypertrophied lenticels as a key adaptation to waterlogging, and that was evident that those lenticels around the base of the stem enlarged in an attempt to, get better ventilation within its root system. So I was quite excited about this because previously it's been quite difficult to really understand waterlogging tolerance, and I think sap flow provides a really good tool to do that. So we've got at least 3 responses, if you like: no response from the Salix alba, a decline throughout the waterlogging period, and then sort of stabilization upon draining, and then a decline through the waterlogging period, and then a continued decline, as we saw in the Acer platanoides. And that continued decline was ultimately indicated by total loss of its leaves. One of the things I'd like to emphasize to arboriculturalists is that the visual analysis is pretty much useless for identifying physiological stress, and we need to be aware of that. This is not good. By the time you can see it visually, it's way too late to intervene. Okay, well, that's some of the sort of, if you like, the scientific, well, this is scientific as well, the kind of experimental approaches to species selection. I just want to really briefly introduce what I think is an exciting new way of thinking around species selection, and that's the sort of biogeographical big data approaches to species selection. And this is where we take distribution data, so where the species are known to occur at a global level, and we then combine that with climate data. So, for example, Harry Watkins has here combined the distribution of some magnolias with the annual rainfall of those locations and something called the warmth index, which is an indication of the warmth, as you might expect. So one of the things that we can do by using this sort of analysis is to look at the way in which those geographical locations of distribution fit within that sort of those climate axes. And so we can look at the slope of a regression, and that will indicate the relative importance of warmth, for example. And the length of the regression line can indicate the range of conditions that the species is suited to. And the intercept can indicate the relative importance of rainfall or water to that species. And so, that's really helpful for understanding where the current distribution of a species fits within a particular set of climate measures. And then Harry's also plotted different global cities onto those geographical charts as well. And you can see where your city or this particular global city fits within the framework of its natural distribution. And so you got London, Stockholm, Berlin, Paris, Vienna, Madrid, Rome there. So you can see that these magnolia species would not be at all suited to, say, Rome and Madrid, based on their current geographical distribution. And in fact, that's, I think, you know, having this sort of analysis is really helpful. You can see that there's not much overlap of the species with those global cities. Something that Henrik was also involved with, well, he's involved with that other paper as well, but this is another paper that Harry and Henrik put out that I think is really interesting, because it takes a similar thing, but there's 4 species here: Acer platanoides, Acer rubrum, Betula pendulum, Carpenter's betulus, and we again see the distribution data plotted on those sort of climate axes, and we can see the current conditions of London, for example, in 2020, and the projections of London in 2050. And we see that actually the projections in London 2050 shifts London as a city outside the natural distribution range of pretty much all of those species. So that, you know, I think should provide real impetus for us to be thinking, well, okay, you know, if London in 2050 is not going to be the sort of climate that these trees naturally would be found in, what should we be planting in those cities? And so I think this whole geographical big data analysis has a real role to play in selecting trees in the future. Okay, I'm aware that I've got to wrap it up now, but just to say that you know, much of this information as possible is integrated into the guide that we used and published through TDAG. You can download it for free. It has about 280 species with a whole range of use potentials. We've talked a little bit about things like drought tolerance, which informs what can go into paved environments. We've talked a little bit about waterlogging tolerance and how we evaluate species that might be useful for a suds environment. Of course, there are crown characteristics in terms of size, density, form, ornamental characteristics that are captured in those profiles, and other information related to notable varieties, allergenicity of pollen, and so on. Alongside that, there's a supplementary database that supports the selector that's in the actual guide. And then there's extensive use of hyperlinks, so it's quite easy to navigate around that guide. In fact, I'm sure that some of you have encountered it. Okay, so that I think is pretty much all I want to say, save for the fact that tree selection doesn't secure establishment. It's one component of securing establishment. And I think it's really important to remember that along with tree selection, you've got to get plant quality right, you've got to get the rooting environment right, and you've got to get fundamental arboricultural practices right, such as the act of planting a tree. Because you can have the right tree, but you plant it too deep and everything goes wrong. So, you know, it's important to look to tree selection, but it's also really critical not to forget some of those other basic processes. I think I'll leave it there, and thanks for your time. I hope that was useful, and perhaps we'll pick up some questions in the session after Henrik's lecture.
Andy, thanks ever so much. As always, very comprehensive, very thought-provoking, and just generally interesting. It's just the challenge is how can we implement the science in the practicalities of planting trees and establishment? Because like your research and Henrik's research, I've followed for a long time, and there's so much information there that it is yeah, just generally thought provoking. So I'd like to come back to you during the conversation to have a chat about some of those characteristics. But thank you ever so much for that presentation. I found it really stimulating and rewarding. So thank you, Andy. So without further ado, I'll move over to Dr. Sjöman, who is a Chelsea fan, but I've never held that against him. And again, I've followed and tracked along with Andy's his work for the last 10 or so years. He's never short of being stimulating, interesting, and occasionally challenging. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sjöman, and over to you, Henrik. If you would like to share screen, that'd be brilliant.
All right. Thank you. You can hear me well?
Yes.
Good, good. All right, I will share screen. There you go. All right. I will follow up a little bit what Andrew have talked about. And when I talked about, or when I thought about some good title for the presentation, this is what I come up with: tactics in tree selection. I work both at the university as a teacher and a researcher, and also at the Botanic Garden in Gothenburg as a scientific curator. And much of my research and also in the teaching is all about this, how to plan for a good selection of tree species for site, but also for function. So therefore, it's a lot of tactics there. But so I will give some example of perspective important to have in mind when we come to tree selection, and also give you some name dropping in the end of different species of trees based on this introduction I will have. But first of all, I just want to give just compliment to Andrew's earlier speaker talk. It's about that there is a fantastic situation we have today compared for 10, 15, 20 years ago, because what we have today is a language we didn't have when I started as a student at the university over 20 years ago. There was nothing what we have today. Today we have a catalog of words we can use in order to argue why we should have trees in urban environment, why tree planters should cost and have to cost in order to be successful. And the words and the language I talk about is of course this: trees and the services trees can deliver. So today we're using this in a very common way, and we do it over and over again. We do it very simple today, but just 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have this knowledge about supporting, provisioning, culture, and regulating ecosystem services. So what we can do today is actually we can argue why trees should be planted there and not there, why we should have that species there and not here. And we can even quantify the value of trees. We can actually calculate money that we can earn by planting trees. Things that was impossible 10, 15 years ago. So things have really happened in a positive way in order to argue for tree and tree planting. But it's also important to bear in mind that a lot of these ecosystem services, even if it's for biodiversity or if it's a culture ecosystem services or for regulating ecosystem, many of these ecosystem services are connected to large and healthy trees. This is not rocket science, it's pretty common sense, because a large tree can filter more air, which also can capture more particles in the air and make the air healthier. They can shade, they can they can block cold winds and so on. A big tree has a better capacity compared to a smaller tree. That means that in urban environments today, we need to take care of the old healthy trees that we have today, so they can continue to be healthy and old. But at the same time, the new trees that we are planting today needs to become these large and old trees. So all these ecosystem services talk that all these benefits of trees and tree planting rely on plant selection, because the link tree for site will be the most important link in a whole change of sustainable urban environment, green infrastructure, and so on. Because if you fail there, this will be the result, where you force tree species into a situation where they have no idea whatsoever to handle. And this is the pretty common thing. This is from southern Sweden, but I think you probably have a few examples of this in Sweden as well. And a thing to think about is these numbers, 25 and 40%. Both research here in Sweden, but also in North America, shows that 25 to 40% of the trees that fail establishment, like the trees on the picture here, the trees that have to be removed because they were probably forced into a situation where they had no idea how to handle. 25 or 40% of these trees will never ever be replaced by a new tree. And this is not shocking, because you have money, you have a budget in order to build a bridge. You don't have extra money if the bridge fails and build another bridge. Same thing for the green environment. You have a budget in order to do tree planting. You don't have a budget for replanting trees that have failed. So that means when it comes to tree selection, we seldom get a second chance. We need to be exactly from the very beginning in order to select the trees for site. So therefore, we need to be very thoroughly understanding the site and the climate on site and matching that to a species of tree. And of course, doing planting beds and so on will also be important. But the big challenge here is how to find this guidance when it comes to tree selection. Because as Andrew said in the beginning, we need to move away from this common or sometimes overused tree species in urban environment and start to use and explore the more rare or untraditional plant materials in order to create this diversity of species and thereby also the resilience towards future challenges for climate or diseases and pests and so on. But the challenge is how to find the information of the untraditional species capacity to grow in inner city environments or in park environments or whatever. And one way, which I would like to discuss and give some kind of insight, is this learning from nature. Because nature is not a nice place. It's actually a terrible place, trees. We like to be in forests. There's a new thing here in Sweden anyway, so called forest bathing. We spend time in the forest and take the energy, and we like to be part of the nature. We should only know how terrible it is to be a tree in the forest, because in nature, trees and all plants are exposed for a competition, a never-ending competition on life and death when it comes to competition of resources, water, nutrients, sunlight, space, and so on. And this never-ending competition has shaped nature, have developed species in order to be successful for specific environments, specific climates, and so on. And this development of specific, we call it traits or tool or personalities in order to be successful for example, dry and warm habitats or shady, cool environments and so on, will give us as plant users, tree users, a very good guidance. And one field of this is what me and Andrew do a lot of research within, is called functional ecology. Because within the umbrella ecology, there are pieces of special parts of ecology, which for us, plant user, gives us a very, very good guidance when it comes to selecting trees, or tactics when it comes to selecting trees for site. And functional ecology is the how and why. How is that species over there successful to grow there and not there? Why is the species successful to grow there and not there? Because this how and why species are successful will give us as tree users a very good guidance or tactics when it comes to selecting trees for site and function. And since we're not in an open room where I can interact in a different way, I normally have this as a question. So I will go do this question and I answer the question right away, but it gives you an idea of how plants think, or how they had developed different kind of tactics in order to be successful in the natural environment, and how that is useful for us. So think about this scenario. On an open field, in a agriculture field, the soil is perfect. It has a high level of water holding capacity, nutrients, and you plant a Pinus sylvestris there. You're watering the pine, you weed all the way, you're weeding so you don't have any competition for the resources, and above ground is unlimited with sunlight. It's a perfect place for a pine. You plant it there, you make it established, and you do exactly the same thing in a nearby field with a populus, an aspen, Populus tremula, where the tree have unlimited resources below and above ground. And also there, you're watering, taking care of the tree and make it established well. And then you leave these two trees alone for 10, 15 years. And then you come back. And the first question is, which of these two species have become tallest, largest? And the answer is, of course, the aspen tree, the Populus tremula. It's maybe 3, 4, 5 times larger than the pine. But the next question is, why is the aspen 3, 4, 5 times taller than the pine? Both are pioneer species. Both like this open ground environment. So they're very good for that. But it's all about this, the investment, the money. We'll go back to the picture here. Because the aspen grows naturally on sites where you have good of resources available, especially below ground, where you have water and nutrients. And by spending on cheap stuff, because normally trees have a budget based on last year's photosynthesis. So they have a budget for investment the next season. So if you translate that to money, you can say that aspen have £100 available for investment 2021 based on the income last year. By spending these £100 on cheap stuff, the wood structure, the leaf structure are very cheap, means that they might have 60 to 70 pounds left where they can invest in growth, both below and above ground. Below ground, invest in a root system so they can capture more resources. Above ground, they can invest in new shoots, more leaves, so they can photosynthesis and have a more active capture of sunlight and thereby resources. The pine, on the other hand, have also £100 in a budget for this growing season. But by spending really, really expensive wood structure and leaf structure, it may be just 20, 30 pounds left for growth, which means that growth below and above ground will be much smaller, much more limited. But the next and last question is, who of these two are most prepared for really dry, warm summer or warm and dry growing condition? Of course, the more expensive investment the pine have prepared itself for more challenging growing condition, while the aspen is less prepared. So this investment the trees do is for a purpose. The cheap investment makes the aspen qualify as a quick grower, fast growing, while the pine's investment is not a fast growing, but preparation for tough conditions. So by understanding the investment different species do, gives you an idea where and how to use them, or where and how not to use them. So this is an example of functional ecology. This how and why. This is what we're going to continue go on. So what we're going to talk mostly about is leaf economics, but also is wood economics. This is a field of research, lots of publication in the field of plant economics, which gives them a good idea how kind of investment, which kind of investment the plants do, which give us as a plant user an idea of how to use them and also how they will be behaving. So this fast and slow spectrum gives an idea of how well prepared they are for different kind of growing condition, but also where to use them and how to use them. So I will translate this fast and slow spectrum into a model which is developed in UK for almost 40 years or 50 years ago, which is this CSR model by Philip Grimes at Sheffield University, who actually passed away just early this year. He done a fantastic job within this field of functional ecology, definitely. But in this model, you have 3 corners. We go through the models, and then after that, I will give you an idea how to use this model and also how to understand this link to tree selection, the tactics of tree selection. And this CSR model have 3 corners, 3 main corners, the C, S, and R. The C parts of the triangle, the model here, is the C strategies, the competitive trees or species. And these are the populous. They are species that in the best and quickest way possible can assimilate the energy and space, both above and underground, and by doing so, get an advantage through powerful growth. So their tactic is just to outgrow other plants. Speed is the key. But by being successful, you need to have more or less unlimited access to resources, both below and above ground. Below is water, nutrients, but above is sunlight. So here we find a lot of species that belongs to the pioneer stage in nature on resource-rich habitats. For example, on rich land, but also river valleys and so on. They are the pioneer species. They are quick, fast, fast, fast. That's the tactic for them. And here we can find some species that are really fast. On the left there, you have Populus tremula erecta. On the right, you have birches. And this is the silver maple, Aces acarnum. The text have disappeared. I'm very sorry about that. This is the silver maple. This is how they grow in the wild, close to rivers or wetlands. So they have more or less unlimited access to water. And this is how they grow in the more horticultural way. They become fast, large trees because they are intense in their investments. Just grow, 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 fast, fast, fast. First, me. That's the tactic of this competitive tree species. The next corner of this model is the S, which is the stress tolerators. And these are the specialists, trees that have or have not the capacity to grow on the rich side. So through evolution, they have to accept less, let's say, resource available habitats. So these are the specialists for example, dry, warm, wet, shaded, poor situation. So these are the specialists. So here you can see the specialist in central Sweden. This is a natural roof garden. This is the new highway close to Stockholm, where you can find this rock garden or this roof garden, where you only find pine trees, Pinus sylvestris, which is in a Swedish nature or in Central Europe also the stress tolerator for really dry, poor growing environment. But you can also find these stress tolerators elsewhere in the world. This is the Mediterranean evergreen oak forest in western US. This is where it's enormous hot today. This is in Western California, where they, I think yesterday they had between 47 and 52 degrees Celsius. And the picture is taken a few years ago when this area experienced 3 years of drought. And here you can see the evergreen oaks. They're standing there and just take the pain and tolerating it. As Andrew said, these are the tolerators. They can just shut up and just take the pain. So they are specialists on these very stressful environments. So these are the S strategists. And then we have the last corner here, the R strategy, the rural species. And these are the species that are very effective in environments which have high levels of disturbance, where you have continuous disturbance. And here you can't find any trees, some shrubs, but no trees, because trees are long-lived organisms. So if you have a massive disturbance every year or every 3rd or 4th year, the trees will never ever be successful here. So here is the most herbaceous plants, annually plants, and this is from a steppe meadow in eastern Romania on the border to Moldavia here. So these are the rural. So when it comes to trees, it's mainly a mix between these more extremes, the C, the competitors, and the stress tolerators. So that was the crash course in understanding the CSR model. But when it comes to us, when it comes to the tactics of tree selection for site and function, this model can be useful, because what we should do, we shouldn't do what we normally do, because we have a project and we think, oh, it should be beautiful with a magnolia or a flowering cherry or maple with its all fantastic autumn colors. Instead, we should ask ourselves, what is the growing condition representing? And also the function we want from this place. How can we make the function? What kind of tactic in order to solve the function of the trees here? So for example, if you have a new built playground in the picture above there, and you have, in Sweden, I don't know the English word for it, but we had some small children playground when you have the sand pit there, which is very dangerous to have exposed, because no kids can be left there on a Sunday summer day, because they need shelter, they need a shade. So therefore, we need a tree that fast become this umbrella over this playground, which makes it possible to play around there in the summer. But also in the picture below, in a new built area, new built housing area, where you want to have trees fast to create some kind of volume, but also maybe create some kind of block for the cold winds, so the outdoor environment in a new housing area become nice. Here you need some kind of quick fix, trees that establish fast, make a difference fast. So who is going to do the job here? Of course, the competitive species, the species that in nature are quick to establish themselves, quick to grow, quick to become a tree, a big tree quick. These are the trees that have to be useful for this kind of function. And by using this quick growing trees, you also have to create a good soil volume for them, because they need resources. On the other hand, in many urban environments, we have, for example, paid environment, roof gardens, or even in old parks where you want to plant something underneath existing tree canopy. Here, we need to have the specialist, the one that can take the stress and still look good, delivering nice flowering, autumn colors, shade, and so on. So here, we need the specialist, the stress tolerators. But in urban environment, normally there is something, not these extremes, probably something in between. For example, in the picture above is this the structural soil, which used in Stockholm model. We have big stones, and the layer, the space between the rocks is available for the roots, and then you fill them with soil. So the rooting environment is pretty good, but it will be times of drought and maybe not that nutrient rich. Or the picture below, in a traffic environment where you have maybe salt in the winter. So you have plantings where the tree is standing and growing in planting sites where you have additional salt into them planting pit. So then you have like a limited amount of stress, but still not as good as unlimited park environment. So these are maybe the species that are something in between when it comes to taking stress, but also have some capacity of growth. So by understanding if the trees are a pure stress tolerator or a pure competitors or something in between, gives an idea of where and how to use them. So by starting there, we can get this how and why they should be used and so on. So this is the functional ecology, but it's more to that. Because when we plant trees today, we need to take care of them, establish them well, so they are self-sufficient on site. But that difference between species, how long time it takes from a new planted tree until the tree is completely self-sufficient on site. For example, the competitor species, for example, the aspen tree, who invest in a root system quick because it just wants more and more resources. That tree, as a new planted tree, will quick go out in surrounding soil volume and become self-sufficient in maybe 1 and 2 growing seasons. So these species might, in park environment like this, might need a watering and care maybe 2 growing seasons if it does really well. But if we work with stress tolerating trees, for example, the pine tree, who invests slowly in a root system, it might take 3, 4, up to 5 years before after planting and the root system have become have grown out in the surrounding soil and become self-sufficient, which means that for pine or stress tolerator, we need to maybe postpone the watering for another 4 or 5 seasons. So by understanding of a tree is a competitors, a stress tolerator, or something in between, it is possible to also become site-specific and species-specific when it comes to the management of establishment of trees. But also, when to buy trees, which kind of, I don't know the English word for it, but the quality of trees. Should it be bare root, burl and burlap, or should it be container growth trees? For competitor species that invest in a root system, fast go out in the surrounding system and fast invest in new roots, it's okay to work with bare rooted or burl and burlap, bold and burlap trees, I think you call it in Sweden, in UK. But for the stress tolerator, where it takes time for the new root system to develop, maybe it's a good choice to work with container growth trees for these ones. Because then you have a package where you have a whole root system. In a bold and burlap tree, a lot of the root system are gone, is away, because when you dig it up, a lot of the fine root system have been digged away. So this is the tactic as well. If you know what kind of strategy the trees have, then it gives you an idea of also not only how long it will need watering in order to be established, but also what kind of type of tree should I buy from the nursery. So this is what we've done the last years, me and Andrew and some other colleagues, to try to get an overview of the tree species. But the problem is, before we started to work, is that there is compilation like this, but they are mainly herbaceous plants. No one has worked a lot with trees and shrubs. So the last year we have working with trees, and here you can see, don't get shocked here, because the stress and ruderal had changed corner of the triangle here. So therefore, it's because when you work with special computer program, they just do it. I have no idea. But anyway, and here you can see that there is no tree species in the ruderal corner, because there is no trees that have that capacity to take disturbance that are occurring all the time on the site. So I thought we should go through this compilation of tree species. We start up here with the competitors. So the competitors was the fast ones, but also the trees that needs good growing condition. Because if they can't have unlimited or good rooting environment and also a lot of good sunlight, they don't have a plan B. They don't know how to handle it. So they will perform poorly on this side. So you need to be very exactly where to plant them. But if you plant them in a good environment that fits the species, then you have a fast established and fast-growing trees. So here you can, of course, Acer saccharinum, the silver maple, is among the maples the fastest one. It behaves more like a poplar rather than a maple, but also populus. Most of the species in the genera are competitive species. They are fast, and also if you want to have a quick fix, that's the tree you should go for. Other trees, of course, is the the English word for this. I think it's a wingnut, could be wrong, but the Pterocarya, yeah, goes fast when you write stuff here. Pterocarya fraxinifolia, the Caucasian one, and this is Pterocarya insignis. There are some other, which is a Chinese species, and there is some other Asian, Japanese, and some other Chinese species in the genera. But still, all of them belongs, as you see in the picture below, they grow more or less along river valleys. So they have more or less unlimited access to resources. So that's why they grow. And if you plant them in this kind of environment, they grow fast and establish really, really easy. And here you can also find a lot of magnolias. As Andrew said, when it comes to drought tolerance, they are pretty poor. And it gives an idea also when you see where the magnolia are staged here in this compilation here, because they grow fast. They rely very much on the root system, and therefore only useful in park and garden environments. Gray walnut, Jugla cinerea, and Tuna sinensis. And why I choose to have Tuna sinensis is in Sweden, probably in UK also, we have a big debate on using Ailanthus and Altissima, which we're not allowed to use. But Tuna sinensis is a species that we can use, which gives more or less the same kind of character with the big leaves there. But that's also a fast-growing, easy established trees, but needs to have a good growing environment in order to succeed well. And also we have Acip sedaplatanus, tulip tree, and also yellowwood, I think you call it, Cladastris canticula. Here's a picture of it, a big tree flowering here. This is upstate New York here. All right, we're moving on. So now it takes this middle group, and here the trees are a little bit more prepared for stress, but also bear in mind, these are the species that are a little bit slower in establishment. They don't invest that much in root system as competitors, as a true competitors. So they need a little bit more time, especially when you establish them. So here you can find species like the tree hazel, Corylus columna, which is a pretty slow trees to establish. But when it is established, when you have the root system out in surrounding soil volume, it do really well and can tolerate pretty high levels of stress, especially drought and heat. And this picture is from Stockholm, where the whole paving areas, the parking lot and also the sidewalk is structured soil. So they have pretty good root volume for the roots to expand into. One of the most drought-tolerant flowering cherries is the Japanese Prunus sargentii, which is a magnificent tree, fantastic pink flowering in the spring, and also the autumn color is fantastic. This is a new square in southern Sweden here with autumn colors, but also amber tree, Liquidambra styracifera, also belong to these groups. And here's our native stuff, the Acer campestre and Sorbus intermedia, the Swedish hornbeam, which we think is pretty good when it comes to drought tolerance. Not the best, but they can take some level of drought and still be pretty quick in their establishment, but not the fastest. So they're typical species that is something in between. And also silver lime, Tilia tomentosa. This is a picture of the cultivar Barcham, which is a more narrow tree crown, which is a perfect tree for parking lot because you don't have any problem with honeydew underneath there. And other species, for example, Metsequoia, but also a rather rare, but still a species or a hybrid that are available among this big tree nursery is Acer sochense, which is hybrid between Acer campestre and Acer cappadocica. But it's a beautiful tree, shiny green leaves in the summer, fantastic yellow autumn colors, and it become this normally multi-stemmed tree, 8-9 meters tall, and rather tolerant when it comes to drought. And now we move down to the specialist, the the stress tolerant species here. And this is important to bear in mind that just because you are stress tolerant, you need to understand which kind of stress factor is the species tolerant for. When it comes to drought, you have a lot of oak species. One of my favorite in this data set is the Hungarian oak, Quercus frainetto, which should be used much, much more. And when you buy the tree for the nursery, important to buy a tree that stands on its own roots, because sometimes they are grafted on the Quercus rubor, which means that they easily get cracked over after 30-40 years or so. Happens a lot here in Sweden and Germany. So be sure to buy Quercus frainetto that are on their own roots. Another species that we use more and more in Sweden anyway for these more warm, dry, sunny places are Elaeagnus angustifolia. On the picture below there, you can see in the Central Asia there how they grows on the steppe. They can really tolerate drought. And on the picture below, on the left here, you can see a new planted tree in Malmö. So they give an expression of an olive tree rather than something else. It's a very exotic tree to use, very winter hardy, drought tolerant, heat tolerant, and also have nitrogen fixing roots, so they can tolerate poor sites as well. They just need a lot of sunlight though. And a picture on the right here is a large specimen at Uppsala Botanic Garden. More examples, Selkova and Serrata and Acer tataricum, which Andrew gave you some insight earlier on. And Cornus mas, one of the smaller, but still a very tolerant tree. It's not only tolerant for drought, but also for shade. So in Caucasus, for example, you can find it in the darkest beech forest to the most sunniest steppe forest edge. So it's one of them. It's have a wide spectrum of stress tolerance, this species. And one of the most drought tolerant tree that me and Andrew have evaluated is Syringa reticulata. This is a picture of the cultivar called ivory silk, and it's flowering in July, August in Sweden anyway, in northern UK as well, I think. And it's a very tolerant tree, but still, as you probably understand in this now, is a very slow established tree. Take time for the tree to establish. It's also take times in order to create some kind of tree crown. So here's a tree that you should buy bigger sizes, because then you actually get something that looks like a tree. But also when it comes to establishment, extend the establishment management with watering for another 4 years or so. But when you have established Syringa reticulata, you have a very, very tolerant tree that can tolerate the toughest drought you can imagine. Together with Coluteria paniculata, which is more or less the same type of character when it comes to tolerating drought. And also some smaller tree shrubs, for example, Carpinus orientalis. And then you have Rhododendron catabiense, which is not drought tolerant, but very, very tolerant for shade. Notophagus antarctica, very tolerant for drought. And now we come down in the corner here, you can see the red dots in the very corner of the stress tolerators. And then you find the conifers. The conifers invest in really expensive stuff. For example, this is Pinus nigra, but together with the other 2 and 3 needle pines, these are the ones that can tolerate drought really, really well. And if you look at the species or the 2 and 3 needle pines that we can grow in UK and in Scandinavia, they are all stress tolerators in the natural environment. Here you can see Pinus lacodermis and Pinus sylvestris. This is Pinus lacodermis on the Balkan, growing here on a south-facing slope. And then we have other conifers, for example, the hemlock, the Tsuga heterophylla, which is not drought tolerant, but one of the most shade tolerant species we can ever use. It can take darkness and still become a really good looking tree, together with a lot of fir trees, for example, Abies homolepis or Abies procera or Nordmanniana. This is from where they grow in the wild there. Abies Nordmanniana grows underneath as a young tree, nursery trees of alders and birch, which they grow through after a while then. And one of the most shade tolerant trees and also rather drought tolerant trees are Taxus baccata. This is a large tree we found in Caucasus a few years ago on the border to Chechnya. So that was a quick presentation of species here, but still the take-home message here is that we need to know more about the how and why, this functional ecology, because that gives us as tree users the tactic we need in order to convince ourselves or others, in order to see into the future, into the crystal ball, that this species will thrive or can tolerate and become these large and healthy trees, and thereby delivering all these ecosystem service that we ask for them. So this is the geeky things that we tree users need to care about when it comes to sustainable tree use and all this fancy word we're throwing around ourselves, because everything ends up in a good selection of tree species. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Oh, Henrik, that was fascinating and informative as usual. So we're going to come into the conversation section now, which means myself and Ellen will appear on screen. And I'm going to open the question with I'm going to open the questions and the conversation with one that I come across all the time. And it's this endless argument in relationship to tree diversity, especially in urban populations, when we're thinking about the use of natives or exotics and the limitations, or is it possible to achieve true diversity in the urban environment using native species alone? So your thoughts, Henrik, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. The thing is, I got this question after my talks, because I show a lot of non-native species in my talks, an example of them. So normally I have a presentation share. I will share screen again here, and I will give a short introduction of a study we did a few years ago, and this is the study we did, and I can send this to Keith. And if you want to read this study, please contact Ellen and Keith, and they can send this to you. But what it's all about is this: what we ask ourselves, because in Sweden there is, of course, it's in UK a movement. Is it okay to use non-native species, or should we only focus on native species? So in this study, we ask ourselves, is it possible from a Scandinavian perspective, and you guys in UK, you're not much better than we are. You have maybe 1 or 2 species more when it comes to tree species than in Sweden. So this can be also useful for you. But we ask ourselves, is it possible to say sustainable urban environment and native only when it comes to tree species? So what we did there, we actually took all the 30 native tree species we have in Sweden. I'm pretty liberal when it comes to native there. So we take some stuff that are not really native, that stuff that have been naturalized, and Carl von Linnaeus here was here. Anyway, so we have around 30 species. And then we took these 30 species through 2 filters. The first filter is which is or will get infested by serious diseases or insects attack. So that is, for example, Asian longhorn beetle, the Dutch elm disease, the ash dieback, things that kills or damage healthy trees that are growing on places where they should be growing optimal. And the remaining species of that first filter, which of these remaining species have the capacity to develop into large healthy trees in inner city environment, for example, paid environments in inner city environment. So we start with 30 tree species. This is the Swedish woody horse. When you come to Sweden, you probably leave Sweden with this kind of stuff. I'm sorry about that, but that's how it is. Anyway, so the first filter is the diseases. Of the 30 species, we have 14 left, which means more than half of the native species in Sweden doesn't have any bright future when it comes to diseases or pest attack. And these diseases and pest attack, it's not if they will come, it's more like when will they come to Sweden. For example, the Asian longhorn beetle, we have an ongoing outbreak in Helsinki, Finland for the moment here. So that's not a thing that we can't look away from. But the next one is, who are the 40 remaining species will develop successful in this kind of environment? This is a inner city environment of Malmö in southern Sweden. And the answer, and this the answer here is based on literature, but also consulting people that knows this kind of things when it comes to diseases, but also tolerance for growing conditions. And the answer is 4 species. And the 4 species are these: Juniperus communis, Prunus avium, Carpinus betulus, and Sorbus intermedia. These are the 4 species that have pretty bright future. But if we should add another filter, for example, of these 4 remaining species, who will become a very successful tree species in order to develop a specific ecosystem service, we probably have deleted 1 or 2 further species. So the question is, for a Western and Northwestern European perspective, sustainable urban environment and native only is not possible. It is. So this question by not using non-native species in urban environment is, for me anyway, as a non-question. Because if we should reach to this resilience towards future challenges, as Andrew said, we can't rely on native only. We need to. But by saying that is using safe species, species that we have been growing for maybe decades, centuries, and haven't become a weed. These are the species we focus on, not the weedy ones. But still, if you go at Kew Gardens and look on the diversity of potential species for UK, there is a lot of things to take to work on from there. So that's my quick answer to that question, Keith. There.
Yeah, thank you. I did a similar study for the UK, and I didn't get it down to 4, but it was very, very few when you actually came down to it. So, Andy, do you want to add anything to that? Andy, we can't hear you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Sorry, it's bound to happen to one of us, wasn't it? Just to reiterate, that point that we're in an extremely complex environment, and this kind of combination of a changing climate, accelerated pests and pathogens, as I sort of set out right at the start of my presentation, just gives a really killer combination if you're limited to a native palette. And I think that the native issue is totally different when you get into rural landscapes. I do think we ought to be very careful, in rural landscapes, but in cities, gardens, then absolutely we need to engage with the exotics in a way that just gives us resilient landscapes, because I think there's all sorts of problems if we narrow our palette down to native. In the eastern United States, they have hundreds of natives potentially to choose from, but in northwestern Europe, we've got 20 or 30 species, and that's really problematic.
Thank you. Ellen, have there been some questions from the delegates?
No, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, we can't hear you. You're distorting on your microphone. You're still distorting, I'm afraid. So if you can sort that out, and I'll ask Andrew and Henrik another question. Henrik, you mentioned Arboreta, and you are actually, I know, the curator at Gothenburg Arboretum, and I was at Kew last Thursday, and like you, and as Andy's mentioned, Arboreta have collections of trees which grow well in the urban environment, because they're growing in the urban environment, even though in a parkland setting. What do you feel about what's the potential for expanding those populations into general use? And what sort of mechanisms do you see in place? So I'd be interested in your views on that.
Yeah, sure. I was invited just before this COVID-19 breakup to Kew to have a lecture by just together with the research committee, and they asked me to be very provocative there. So I was there, and I told them that as a botanic collection, we need to care about the world outside the fence of a botanic collection. And there is a huge potential to take the knowledge of the diversity we have been growing for decades in the botanic garden, to take that and make it available for the world outside, because the world outside the fence of this plant collection needs the knowledge and the guidance. And by combining the stuff that Andrew showed and what we've done, we're screening pre-collection to today, how they're drought tolerant, or what the capacity to deliver different kind of ecosystem. So if we can add that and experience how to grow them from Arboretum and Botanic Garden, that should be definitely out to become available for tree planners and landscape architects and designers. But that means that nursery have also an important link in this chain to start to grow them. And so I think there needs to become a better collaboration between Arboretum and Botanic Garden and nursery to make this the genetic materials available, because we can't just name dropping nice plants, but if they're not available, why just name dropping? It's no use. So so that I'm arguing for that a lot. So the old collection, the stuff they have been collecting from China abroad for decades ago, they are available for the nurseries to grow. But the new stuff they are collecting today, we need to have special permission from the countries where we're collecting in order to make it available. But that's up to the Botanic Garden and the Arboretum to negotiate to make these plant materials available. Because as Andrew told me, it's not only the species we have to care about for the future, we need also to care about the genetic materials, the genotype, the provenance, the ecotype of the species, which will become even more important to know from where it originates and from which kind of climate the growing conditions are. But that kind of records the Botanic Gardens have. So I believe that Botanic Garden and Arboretum should take bigger, to be more involved in urban forestry than they are today, definitely. So this is a shame. So I think we can do much, much more as a Botanic Gardens.
Thank you. Andrew, would you like to offer?
Well, yeah, just to sort of build on that, when we did the survey that informed our approach to developing the TDAG selection guide, only 4% of those that were involved with selecting trees actually engaged with local botanical collections. So that's a really low number of people engaging with potentially local or regional botanic collections, which can give great insights into what's likely to perform well in that area. As Henrik said, there is a challenge between having available plant material at a commercial scale and what's in a botanic garden. The two don't always match up. In fact, they very often don't. But I do think, you know, we're serious about getting a diverse population into regional cities, then engaging with the regional botanic collections is going to be critical.
Okay, thank you. Ellen, is your microphone working now?
I have no idea. Can you
Yes.
hear me?
It's working. It's working.
Excellent. So we have got a few questions on the chat. If I perhaps run through them in order.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Start with one for Andy. It was from Thomas on the chat, and we're asking the suggestion of ginkgo as drought tolerant. Do we have any info on lifespan in UK cities? Apparently the US Forestry Service estimates their lifespan in cities at 10 years. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would definitely say we've got really good evidence that it is drought tolerant. That's one of the species we've got Tergalos 0.4, and can't remember it exactly off the top of my head, but I think it is in the beyond minus 3.5 megapascals. So it definitely fits in the tolerant category. So it certainly is drought tolerant. In terms of the 10-year lifespan, that seems, you know, not to reflect reality. I mean, you look at the ancient ginkgo in Kew Gardens. Okay, that's obviously a much better habitat than a street environment, but I'm absolutely certain that you could find ginkgos way beyond 10 years old, you know, walking around London. Certainly, I mean, I've seen quite a lot of young plantings in London, not any really old avenues, but they may be there. I mean, others that manage and are more familiar with London's trees could tell me that, but for sure, you would be expecting ginkgos to reach maturity if the conditions are right. Yeah, Henrik, I don't know what your thoughts are on ginkgo.
Yeah, for me, ginkgo is a very long-lived trees, and the numbers from US Forest, they're probably the one. They did a survey of trees in New York City when they said that the lifespan of a tree is between 6 and 10 years in very hardcore urban environment, because there is no space for very good planting pits, and also the tear and wear of the trees in this environment. The trees doesn't go older, but if you plant it in a courtyard, in a square, or in a park environment, they can become very, very old. So these numbers of older trees is very much based on maybe a study when they have studied the trees in the more extreme urban habitats, maybe. So that's why I think it is, because ginkgo is a long-lived tree. In Sweden, we have been growing ginkgo as a street tree in southern Sweden for 30, 40 years, and they're doing very, very well. It's a good tree.
Well, I had a question for Andy as well. I assume a lot of the research has been done on the drought tolerance of mature trees. How much of that relates to trees that are actually establishing? Because certainly, given our position at Barcham, when we're advising customers and talking to people about newly planted trees, are the trees that are good in the long term at being tolerant to drought just as good as an establishing tree?
I'd say that they're not as good. I mean, as an established tree will always have better resilience than a establishing tree. But I do think there will be commonality where we've got species that have got inherent characteristics towards drought tolerance. That will be present in the young tree leaving the nursery, as well as in the mature established tree. And I mean, what Henrik and I try to advocate with some of the sort of scientific sort of trait-based approaches is that we shouldn't be selecting trees that, say, rely on a deep rooting strategy for an urban environment, even though that might look, when you observe it in nature, as to be quite a tolerant tree. If you take that strategy away from it by putting it in, relatively shallow soils, podium plantings, that sort of thing, then actually what you've got is a really vulnerable tree, because that's not the way it would deal with drought in its natural environment. So by understanding more about the ecology and the strategies through this sort of functional approach, we can make recommendations that are more sensible. So I suppose to really simply answer your question, established trees will always be more resilient. So we can never just bypass the establishment phase and not follow up with the aftercare. But there are some inherent species characteristics that will be true in young trees as well as the mature tree.
Thank you. I've got a question that's come on the chat for Keith. I think it's probably best directed at you, if that's all right. It's from Jonathan Smith, and he says, in the private development sector, it's all well and good selecting alternative species. If they aren't readily available in the UK or at reasonable cost, they simply won't get planted. Where does the responsibility lie between landscape architect using a very narrow and predictable species palette and the nurseries supplying them and bringing new lines to market? So it's a Barcham question, that one.
Good question, Jonathan.
Yeah, it is a good question, which I haven't got an answer for. It's a chicken and egg, isn't it? We promoted at Barcham Celtis australis as a good urban tree. And for the first 2 seasons we grew it, and we had 2 rows of 200 or 300 trees. We didn't sell more than about 10. So for us, that investment in a species we thought was resilient in the urban domain was actually an investment that we got no return on. So that was our gamble. And that repeats itself with different species. There's several of the species that both Andy and Henrik have referred to. Colereteria, for instance, Sephora japonica, or Stiphnalobium, as it's now called, Celtis. These are all trees that have the potential to offer really strong characteristics and have the tolerances associated with growing in the urban environment. But they tend not to sell because there's a break somewhere in the palette of architects. Architects, designers tend to gravitate towards trees they're familiar with, trees they know well. Also, they tend to be coloured by aesthetic choice. So it's like, can I get a tree with red bark because it matches the brickwork of my hard landscaping, as opposed to, will the tree survive developing? The answer is, in my view, is that early liaison between developer and nursery. So that it's then possible for the nursery to contract grow on behalf of the developments, on behalf of the developer. The nursery investment is then tied in with security, and the developer is able to use trees that are somewhat different, and that wider circle is squared. But the other one is, where does the investment, who takes the hit if the trees are not demanded or there's no demand for them? So I hope that answers the question, but it really is quite a difficult one. Andy, Henrik, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with that, because it is a gamble as a nursery. You don't want to have this burning of trees in the end of the season because you can't sell them, so it's no market. So there is, I think, the university and the nursery industry need to work together in order to create good guidance. For example, that Andrew presented we did for a few years ago, this TDAG. So I think we need to educate everyone of the species. But I can agree. I can understand the landscape architect. They don't want to take the step into the unknown to start using less traditional species, because they don't want to be famous to become the landscape architect to design the square or the housing area where everything died. So there is very easy to go on the safe ones over and over again. And by moving away from that, I think that me and Andrew have a responsibility to create some kind of guidance and confidence when it comes to tree selection, to start to move away from it. So it's no simple. It's very difficult to point a finger to that group or them, they're wrong. So what we should do, which is a lack here in Sweden, is that there are cities that do a lot of work to planting untraditional species and are very successfully, but they never ever share that. So that's cities that create that plant this untraditional species and become successful. It should share, and by sharing the knowledge and experience of using Celtis australis in London, for example, maybe can give confidence for other cities to move towards using Celtis australis, because that's, I think, is the best way of confidence to see in real life in a nearby cities, to see that the tree is growing there. So that's the key here in Sweden, where the university trying to pick up all these cool trees they planted and publish it and make it available, that kind of guidance there. Yeah, I don't know. It's, that was a clear answer. I don't know.
I think that
Funny
I
enough.
agree with all of that. I mean, it is about, you know, people like you and I, and there's lots of other groups. You know, there's some groups in Canada, groups in Australia, certainly working on the sort of science approach, and that we need to make sure is translated in a way that, you know, practitioners can engage with it. But there is also, you know, a really big issue with landscape architects perhaps trying to do the right thing, and then deviations in contract that end up meaning that the trees that they've originally specified don't end up in the ground, and that's never challenged, and the planning authorities don't hold the landscape contractors to account. And so I think, you know, it is also to do with procurement, and that the way that the procurement of trees is managed, or not effectively managed, and how easy it is to substitute trees that have been specified in the landscape plan for something else, for often fairly spurious reasons. So I think, you know, there is some, you know, there is science and knowledge translation, but there's also kind of policy level things that can make a really big difference as well.
Just following on from what Henrik said, we've had an observation from Rick from Southend. He said that he's planted Corotera and Celtis for a while and that they do very well. So it's quite nice to see that.
I can see one at the end of my garden.
Yeah, Corotera is being planted all the way up to Stockholm, and they're doing well. So there is a safe one, Corotera. Celtis, Occidentalis, the American one, is doing great here in Sweden.
Yeah.
The Australis, we have one tree in Malmö so far, so I don't know much about that, but Occidentalis is doing well. But my tip when it comes to Celtis, buy a big tree, because there is a nightmare to do a tree of a young Celtis. So big tree, so they Barcham have done most of the work for you. So that's my tip for Celtis. But it's a good tree, definitely.
I agree. Yeah.
I had a question for Henrik, if possible, related to the CSR model.
Yeah.
There was a tree sort of that sat quite well in the middle, and
yeah.
I don't think we discussed that. What tree was that?
Yeah, that's Acer palmatum. So Acer palmatum is like not good in everything, or pretty good in everything. So it's pretty easy to start, rather fast. When it comes to tolerance, it's rather good shade tolerance, but not that bad. So it's a typical in the very middle Acer palmatum. That's the cultivar that we have in the research. Acer palmatum is that one.
It looked a bit lonely.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, we've got about 4 minutes to run, so I think it's time for me to round up. And first of all, to thank Henrik, Andrew, for, I found, really good, really interesting, really informative presentations. And for Ellen for actually tidying up all the bits that I can't do because of my technological incompetence. So to thank the panelists, but also to thank you folks for staying, because at maximum today we had about 225 people here, which I thought was really good. And most of you have stayed the course for quite a long session, so 2 hours. So thank you very much for attending. I would say, if you have any questions that emanate from today that you want to send through to either Ellen or myself at Barcham, we'll try to answer them. If we can't answer them, then we'll happily refer to Henrik and Andy, and we'll try to provide answers for you. This webinar is the first of a proposed series. It was largely an experiment, so thank you all for being guinea pigs. And look out for the second Barcham briefing, which is likely to take place about the second or third week in August. And finally, what I'd like to ask to do, and this is the bit where I get the begging bowl out, is that you've, Andy in particular, and Henrik, put an awful lot of work into the Trees and Design Action Group guide, tree species selection. Trees and Design Action Group is a charity and it's largely run on a voluntary basis, but the work that TDAG does has to be financed. If you value it, could I ask you to go visit the TDAG website details, which Ellen is just about to put up on screen, and make a voluntary contribution to the ongoing work of TDAG, which you can do quite simply through Virgin Money Giving on the TDAG website. So with that, another vote of thanks for everybody, because personally, I think it's very successful. It's very frustrating not being able to see any of you and gauge your reactions. But anyway, thanks ever so much for attending. And
one more.
Go on, Ellen. Go on.
Are we able to share the presentations, Andy and Henrik?
Parts are mine, because there's some parts is not published yet. So I can't talk about it, but I can't share it. So much of this name dropping in the end is not going to be available, but the rest I can share, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think definitely, yeah.
For everybody, we'll share what we can.
On that note, this benevolence of Barcham has been thwarted by the two speakers. But anyway, enough said. Thank you all very much for attending. Thank you for your time, greatly appreciated. And once again, thank you for the work of the panelists, which again is greatly appreciated. So with that, I guess it's down to me to push the button that says bye-bye. Cheerio. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks. That's it, you've binned them off.